Okay, picture this. You're standing on a ridge 16,000 years ago, and your friend just asked you a question that should be simple. Where's the river? And you have no words for north, no words for miles, no paper, no pen. Writing hasn't been invented yet. Won't be invented for another 10,000 years. So how do you answer? You crouch down, pick up a stick, and you start scratching lines into the dirt. Congratulations, you just made a map, and you had no idea you were about to start one of the strangest, longest, most quietly world-changing projects in human history. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about maps. They're not really about geography. Not at first. They're about power. They're about survival. They're about one human trying to shove the entire terrifying, incomprehensible size of the world into something small enough to hold in your hand, or draw on a wall, or carve into a rock. Every single map ever made is really just someone saying, I was scared of not knowing where I was, so I fixed. Tonight, we're going all the way back. Caves, clay tablets, silk, bone, stars. We're going to watch humans slowly, awkwardly, brilliantly figure out how to draw the entire planet before anyone had even seen more than a tiny sliver of it. And by the end, you're going to look at the Maps app on your phone completely differently. Let's start at the very beginning because the oldest known map on Earth is not what you'd expect. It's not Egyptian, it's not Babylonian. It's a rock, a literal rock found in a cave in Spain called a bounce, and it's roughly 14,000 years old. Older than the pyramids by more than 10,000 years. Older than farming, older than pottery. On this rock, someone carved mountains, a river, herds of animals, and what looks suspiciously like meeting points. Archaeologists think it might have been used to hunt. Think about that for a sec. Before humans had permanent houses, before we had writing, before we had the wheel, we already had the instinct to draw the world from above. From a bird's eye view we had never actually seen. That's not a small thing. That's your brain doing something genuinely strange, imagining a perspective no human eye could physically reach, just to help another human find their way. And it wasn't just about hunting. Some researchers believe certain cave paintings, including sections of Lascaux in France, might double as star charts. Dots positioned in patterns that echo constellations, possibly used to track seasons for migration and hunting. We can't prove it with total certainty, this is still debated, but if it's true, it means our ancestors were mapping the sky before they were mapping the ground. Which honestly tracks. When you don't have GPS, and you don't have street signs, and you definitely don't have a friend texting you directions, the sky is the only thing in the entire world that behaves predictably every single night. Stars don't move the furniture, stars don't lie. So humans start small. A rock, a cave wall, a stick in the dirt. But here's where it gets interesting because the next leap forward doesn't come from someone drawing better. It comes from someone inventing a whole new way to record information permanently. Clay. We jump forward to ancient Babylon, and specifically to a small clay tablet now sitting in the British Museum called the Imago Mundi. It's about the size of your hand. It's roughly 2,600 years old, and it is, as far as we know, the oldest surviving map of the entire known world. Not a hunting ground, not a local valley. The world. Babylon sits proudly in the center, because of course it does. Nobody in history has ever made a map that didn't put themselves in the middle of it. Around Babylon, a ring representing the Euphrates River. Beyond that, a circular ocean the Babylonians called the Bitter River, surrounding everything they knew like a moat around a castle. And beyond that ocean, floating out in the unknown, triangular regions labeled as distant land. Some real, some clearly mythical, home to strange creatures and half-remembered stories from travel. Here's what gets me about this tab. It's not really accurate, not in any way we'd recognize today, but it's not trying to be a precise measurement of the Earth. It's trying to be a worldview carved in clay. It's part science, part religion, part propaganda for how important Babylon is. And that combination, accuracy fighting with ego, is going to show up again and again for the next 3,000 years. Spoiler alert, it still shows up today. Ever noticed how most world maps put your own country suspiciously close to the center? Yeah, Babylon started that habit and humanity never really dropped it. Now let's hop over to Egypt, because Egyptians, as usual, were doing something quietly more practical. Forget cosmic worldviews for a second. The Egyptians had gold mines out in the eastern desert, and gold mines are useless if your workers can't find them or get supplies to them. So around 3,200 years ago, someone drew what's now called the Turin Papyrus map. It shows roads, mountains rendered in pink and gray to indicate different rock types, mining settlements, and distances. This is genuinely one of the earliest known geological maps in human history. Not mythology, not symbolism, an actual working document meant to get real people to a real location to do a real job. It's basically an ancient Google Maps route to the office, except the office is a gold mine in the middle of the the desert, and getting lost means dying of thirst, not just being late for a meeting. And that split right there between the symbolic map and the practical map is going to define cartography for the next few thousand years. Some maps exist to tell you where you are. Some maps exist to tell you what the universe means. And sometimes, confusingly, a single map tries to do both at once. Which brings us to Greece, because the Greeks are about to do something absolutely wild. They're going to try to measure the entire planet using a stick, a shadow, and math. No satellites, no plane, no modern instruments of any kind. Around 2200 years ago, a scholar named Eratosthenes, working at the famous library in Alexandria, heard something interesting. In the city of Siena, far to the south, at noon on the summer solstice, sunlight shone directly down a deep well with no shadow at all. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, on that exact same day, a vertical stick still cast a small shadow. Most people would hear that and think, weird, and move on with their day. Eratosthenes did not move on with his day. He measured that shadow's angle. He combined it with the known distance between the two cities, and using nothing but geometry, he calculated the circumference of the entire Earth. His answer was off from the modern measurement by roughly 2%. 2% using a stick and a well. In a world where the fastest way to send a letter was a guy on a horse. This wasn't a lucky guess either. This was the exact moment map making stopped being purely symbolic and started becoming mathematical, and it opened the door for someone even more ambitious. Enter Claudius Ptolemy, working in that same city of Alexandria. A few centuries later, Ptolemy wrote a book called Geography, and in it, he did something nobody had really pulled off before. He assigned coordinates, essentially an ancient version of latitude and longitude, to over 8,000 locations across the known world. Cities, rivers, mountain ranges, all of it plotted on a grid system. Ptolemy's world was badly distorted by modern standards. He genuinely believed Africa curved around to connect with Asia, sealing off the Indian Ocean like a lake, and he underestimated the size of the Earth using a different, less accurate figure than Eratosthenes had calculated. That mistake, funnily enough, is going to matter a lot later. Stick a pin in that. But here's the wild part. Ptolemy's work basically vanished from Western Europe for over 1,000 years. Lost, buried, forgotten in the chaos after the fall of Rome, and when it eventually resurfaced during the Renaissance, translated and rediscovered, it reshaped the entire European understanding of the planet all over again, as if humanity had to relearn something it already knew centuries earlier. Imagine losing your homework, finding it again 1,000 years later, and it turns out to still be mostly correct. That's Ptolemy's geography. And Ptolemy wasn't working in a vacuum either, at least not literal. The Romans, around that same broad era, were mapping the world too, just with an entirely different obsession. Road. There's a surviving medieval copy of a Roman map called the Peutinger Table, and it is frankly unhinged by modern standards. It's over 20 feet long and only about a foot tall. This stretched, squished, almost cartoonish ribbon of a map because it wasn't trying to show you accurate shapes of countries at all. It was showing you the road network. Every twist of the Roman road system across 3 continents, laid out like a subway map centuries before subway maps existed, distances between way stations marked clearly. Because a Roman courier didn't care what Gaul looked like from space. He cared how many miles to the next inn. Function completely overriding form. Sound familiar? It should. That's exactly the same instinct that shaped the Turin Papyrus back in Egypt, just applied to an empire instead of a mine. While Ptolemy was calculating coordinates in Alexandria, over on the other side of the planet, an entirely separate map-making tradition was developing completely independently, with zero contact with Greece or Rome. China. The oldest surviving Chinese maps come from a tomb at Mawangdui, and they're roughly 2,100 years old, drawn on silk. Silk. Not clay, not papyrus, silk. These maps are shockingly precise, showing rivers, roads, and military positions with a level of accuracy that would make a modern cartographer nod approvingly. And a few centuries later, a Chinese official named Pei Shu formalized something genuinely revolutionary, a set of 6 principles for accurate map making, including consistent scale and grid-based measurement. Grid-based measurement in the 3rd century. Pei Shu essentially invented the graph paper approach to cartography over 1,000 years before it became standard practice in Europe. While parts of medieval Europe were drawing maps with sea monsters where accurate coastlines should be, Chinese cartographers were already using proportional grids to keep their maps mathematically consistent. Two civilizations, same goal, wildly different levels of precision, developing in near total isolation from one another. Now here's where the story does something I genuinely love, because not every culture needed clay tablets or silk scrolls or mathematical grids to map their world. Some cultures built maps you could hold, and some cultures built maps you could sing. Let's go to the Pacific Island. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean, centuries before European sailors dared to lose sight of land, using something called stick charts. These were physical objects built from palm ribs and small shells, representing wave patterns, swell directions, and the locations of islands, not drawn from above like a bird's eye view, felt from the deck of a canoe, reading the actual rhythm of the ocean itself. A skilled navigator could lie down in the hull of a canoe at night, feel the pattern of swells hitting the hull, and know with real precision which direction land lay in. No compass, no sextant, just thousands of years of accumulated, memorized, physically internalized knowledge, passed from master to apprentice, treated with the same seriousness as a scientific discipline, because it was one. And then there's Australia, where Aboriginal cultures developed something even harder to categorize using our normal definition: songline, routes across the continent encoded into songs, stories, and ceremony, where the melody itself and the sequence of landmarks it describes functions as a navigational map. Walk the correct route in the correct order, singing the correct song, and you would successfully cross vast, often brutal stretches of the Australian outback. This system has reportedly been used continuously for over 40,000 years, making it quite possibly the oldest continuously used mapping system on the entire planet. Let that sink in for a second. While Babylon was carving its clay tablet, while Egypt was mapping gold mines, while Eratosthenes was measuring shadows with a stick, Aboriginal Australians had already been navigating an entire continent through song for tens of thousands of years. We don't talk about this nearly enough. A map doesn't have to be something you look at. Sometimes a map is something you sing. One more stop before we leave this part of the world tour, because the Inca Empire genuinely breaks the pattern in a way that still puzzles historians. The Inca built an empire stretching over 24,000 miles of road, connecting mountains, deserts, and coastline across South America. An infrastructure network that rivaled Rome. And as far as we can tell, they did it without ever developing a written map, or even writing itself in the traditional sense. Instead, they relied on something called the quipu, an intricate system of knotted, colored cords used to record numbers, census data, and possibly, according to some researchers, spatial and organizational information as well. Historians are still debating exactly how much geographic information a quipu could actually encode. But what we do know for certain is this: an empire that size does not function without some serious internal system for tracking distance, territory, and logistics. The Inca clearly had a working mental and physical map of their empire. They just weren't storing it the way anyone else on this list was. No clay, no silk, no parchment, knots. It's a genuine reminder that mapping isn't really about the specific medium at all. It's about whether the information successfully gets from one person's head into another person's hand, in a form that survives the trip. Okay, quick pause, because I want you to notice something. Every single culture we've covered so far solved the exact same problem: how do I know where I am and how do I get somewhere else, using completely different tools. Clay, papyrus, silk, shells, stone, song. Same question, wildly different answers. That's not a coincidence. That's just what happens when the same basic human fear, the fear of being lost, gets filtered through completely different environments and completely different available material. Being lost is universal. The solution never was. All right, let's head back toward Europe, because things are about to get significantly more chaotic in a genuinely fascinating way. During the medieval period, European mapmaking took a strange turn. Enter the T and O map. Picture a capital letter T inside a capital letter O. That's basically the whole design. The O represents the ocean surrounding the world. The T represents the three major rivers dividing the three known continents: Asia, Europe, and Africa. And sitting proudly at the very center of the map where the T meets is Jerusalem. Not because of any measurement, not because of any survey, because of religious symbol. Jerusalem was considered the spiritual center of the world. So that's exactly where cartographers put it: geographic accuracy be damned. The most famous surviving example is the Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around the year 1200, and it is an absolute fever dream of a document. It includes real geography, sort of. It includes biblical events illustrated directly onto the map, like the Garden of Eden marked as an actual physical location. It includes mythical creatures lurking in unexplored regions. Griffin, Cyclops, people with faces in their chests because apparently that rumor traveled well. This wasn't really designed as a navigational tool at all. It was closer to a religious teaching aid, a visual encyclopedia of the medieval Christian worldview, with geography as more of a loose suggestion than a rule, which honestly raises a great question. At what point does a map stop being a map and start being propaganda with rivers drawn on? Because medieval Europe respectfully blurred that line completely. Now, while European monks were busy sketching Eden onto parchment, the most advanced cartography on the planet was actually happening somewhere else entirely, in the Islamic world. In the 12th century, a Sicilian king named Roger II, ruling over a genuinely diverse, multicultural court, commissioned a scholar named Muhammad al-Idrisi to build the most accurate map of the world that had ever existed. Al-Idrisi spent 15 years cross-referencing accounts from merchants, sailors, and travelers pulled from across the entire known world, from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa to China. The final result, called the Tabula Rogeriana, was so far ahead of its time that European mapmakers were still leaning quietly for the next 300 years. And here's a detail I genuinely love. Al-Idrisi, like most Islamic cartographers of the era, often drew his maps with south at the top instead of north, which sounds small until you realize it means the entire concept of north automatically being up is not some universal law of nature. It's a choice, a cultural habit that stuck around mostly because later European mapmakers happened to be the ones who ended up printing the most influential maps. Flip a coin a few different ways throughout history and you'd be tilting your head sideways to read a map right now, and it would feel completely normal. But while European monks were drawing sea monsters in the margins, something far more practical was developing in the Mediterranean, driven by people who had absolutely zero patience for symbolism because their lives depended on accuracy. Sailor. Portolan charts emerge starting around the 13th century, and they look completely different from anything before them. Covered in a dense web of straight lines called rhumb, lines radiating out from compass roses used to plot precise sailing directions between ports. No mythical creatures, no Garden of Eden, just coastline, harbors, and direction, refined constantly through direct first-hand experience. Updated voyage after voyage after voyage. These were working documents built by people who would literally die if the coastline was drawn incorrectly. Function over decoration, accuracy over ego, a genuinely massive leap forward in practical cartography, and one that quietly set the stage for what was about to happen next. Because Europe was about to go through a map-making explosion unlike anything the world had seen before, driven by one simple, deeply human motivation: money. We're now in the 15th and 16th centuries, the so-called Age of Exploration, though maybe Age of Very Expensive Curiosity would be more accurate. European kingdoms wanted spices, wanted gold, wanted trade routes that didn't require crossing through hostile, expensive middlemen. And that meant, for the first time in human history, there was serious, sustained, well-funded pressure to map the entire globe accurately, not for religion, not for symbolism, for profit. In 1507, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller published a world map that did something genuinely historic. It was the first map to ever use the name America, honoring the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, who had correctly argued that the lands Columbus stumbled into weren't actually part of Asia, but an entirely separate continent nobody in Europe had known existed. Just sit with that for a second. There was a moment, a specific year, a specific document where an entire continent, home to millions of people who had been living rich, complex lives for thousands of years, got a name slapped onto a European map for the very first time, as if it hadn't existed before someone from Europe happened to write it down. That's not just cartography. That's a genuinely uncomfortable piece of history, hiding in plain sight on a 500-year-old piece of paper. And then, in 1569, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator solved a problem that had frustrated sailors for centuries. How do you draw a curved spherical planet onto a flat rectangular piece of paper without the directions becoming completely useless? His solution, now called the Mercator projection, allowed sailors to draw a single straight line on the map and follow a constant compass bearing the entire way, an absolutely massive practical breakthrough for actual navigation. But here's the twist, and it's a genuinely wild. To make that straight line trick work, Mercator had to distort the actual size of land masses, and the closer you get to the poles, the worse that distortion becomes. Greenland, on a Mercator map, looks roughly the same size as the entire continent of Africa. In reality, Africa is about 14 times larger. 14 times. And here's the part that will genuinely mess with you. That same 450-year-old projection, built specifically to help sailing ships hold a compass bearing, is still the default map projection used by Google Maps today. You have almost certainly looked at a badly distorted, centuries-old sailing tool this week and had absolutely no idea. A tool built to help wooden ships not crash into rocks in the 1600s is quietly still shaping how billions of people picture the relative size of the entire planet right now in your pocket. So let's zoom all the way back out because I want you to really absorb the scale of what we just walked through. A carved rock in a Spanish cave, 14,000 years ago. A clay tablet in Babylon putting itself proudly at the center of the universe. A papyrus map leading workers to Egyptian gold. A Greek scholar measuring the entire planet with a stick and a shadow. Silk maps in China, precise enough to embarrass some modern hand-drawn sketches. Pacific navigators reading the ocean itself with their body. An entire continent mapped through 40,000 years of continuously sung story. Monks drawing Eden next to sea monsters. Sailors refusing to include anything that wasn't proven true. And finally, a projection built for wooden ships that's still distorting how you picture the world on your phone screen right now, in this exact moment, whether you realized it or not. Here's what actually connects every single one of them, across 14,000 years, across cultures that never once made contact with each other. Every map, every single one was really an attempt to answer one basic, deeply human question. Where am I, and how do I get to where I actually need to be? That's it. That's the whole thing. Underneath the gold, the science, the religion, the ego, the propaganda, the spice trade, every map humans have ever made is really just a very elaborate, occasionally gorgeous, occasionally deeply flawed answer to being scared of getting lost. So next time you casually open a Maps app, glance at it for 2 seconds, and effortlessly find your way to a coffee shop you've never been to before. Take a second to actually notice what's happening. You're holding the end result of 14,000 years of carved rock, clay tablets, silk scrolls, sung stories, and sailors who quite literally staked their lives on getting the coastline exactly right. That blinking blue dot on your screen isn't just a dot. It's the very last chapter of the longest-running project in human history. Humanity's endless, stubborn, remarkably creative refusal to ever stay lost.